Hey, greetings everybody. It is GleeCon here again with another episode of Lore of Warcraft. On our last episode, we looked at some more of our little side venture into the Warcraft, the role-playing game, D&D campaign setting, and we looked at the map, the worlds we read about and discussed some of them, which was actually pretty neat because it's so clear that the people who obviously contributed to writing that book, that campaign setting, are some of it, was showed its face in Warcraft 3, but they were obviously hard at work constructing continents, and almost all of it, as is shown in that book, which is probably, I don't know, at least 3 years before World of Warcraft comes out, is the way we're going to see in World of Warcraft. So that was neat. We also saw, we've been reading some Cycle of Hatred. We're seeing the tensions rise between the humans and the Alliance and the Horde, and we Chronicles, we were up to the founding of Durotar. So stay a while and listen as we did this. I did it again. I did miss, there's a small, in the timeline, I missed a small little chunk. So after the year 24, 1 year after, this is where Cycle of Hatred starts. Well, year 23 is, I guess, technically after, it's, I don't know. I guess it's kind of, I guess there's a 2 year period in between World of Warcraft and the year 23 after the Dark Portal is still technically concerned with the Third War, but it is after the war was over. There's not a lot there. There is only two things that we're concerned with that are not either in-game things or Wowpedia entries or non-canon material, and all of those we'll cover in the sort of parallel episodes we've been doing at some point. But there are two things. One is finishing this this story right here, which we'll get to in a second. The other is a comic trilogy, so not really a major thing. We'll just kind of mix that trilogy in as we go along, because Cycle of Hatred, since it's a whole novel, we'll be fine mixing it in. I'm not really that worried about anything happening. I caught it quick enough that this is all basically happening within a 1 year period of each other. But technically, what we're about to read now, did happen, I don't know, at least a few months probably before Cycle of Hatred began. So this is the end of the Blood of the Ancients, Blood of the Highborne story, which is part of the Paragon's collection of short stories. However, this one is massive. It's certainly a novello, and even worse, it's divided into only 4 chapters. Chapters 1 and 3 of those were fine, normal chapter length things. Chapter 2, if you remember, was one of our longest straight chapters we've ever read. Stay a while and listen as we do chapter 4. It's called Dawn of the Blood Knights, and this may vie for that. This is going to be a long one, so buckle up, grab a snack, grab a drink. If you're going to sit this one out, the good thing is this will finish our story. But yeah, this is going to be a long one. You were prideful. You let your fear control you. You failed them. No. You let Vandalor die, and now his soul is damned. No. You should have died with them. But I did not. I could not. Perhaps I should have died with the others. No! I don't know who that is supposed to be, like, dialoguing between. Liadrin awoke within the squalid, dust-filled parlor. Despite the 5 years that had transpired since the attack on the Sunwell, many of the wounds she had suffered during that time simply refused to heal. So this is where you can tell what the timeline is and why it's been highlighted 11 times. Because this is 5 years after the end of, or the middle of, the Reign of Chaos. So this is after the events of the Frozen Throne, and it puts us in that period somewhere between. Of all the emotions, it seemed to her that guilt was the most steadfast, the most resistant to purging. It could not be neatly tucked away or pushed aside. It would not be ignored, and so it persisted. A dull ache clouded her head. Her body felt weak. Her skin was coated in a thin sweat. It had been too long since she had fed. As she sat up, a swarm of rats scurried across the debris-strewn floor. Crows cawed from somewhere outside. Leadrin struggled to her feet and plodded through the crumbling doorway into the roofless antechamber. She sensed it even before she could see it. A small green crystal lying atop a dilapidated sideboard among weapons and armor pieces, spoils of her recent battles. The crystal was another gift from her unseen benefactor. She had received several in the past few weeks, always covertly, although she had a good idea as to their source. She crossed the room, stretched out her hand, and snatched up the gem. It sat against the wall beneath a glassless window. She drew the crystal close, clenched it within her fist, closed her eyes, and felt the magic flow through her like a warm, persistent stream. It spread throughout her body, saturating her. Her eyes that had once been blue before the attack and fallout, before the quick, crippling withdrawal, snapped open, burning a brilliant green. Leadrin smiled as she unfurled her fist. The spent crystal lay within, nothing more now than a blackened stone. With a flick of her wrist, the former high priestess cast the stone into a darkened corner. She sighed heavily, leaned back, and relaxed once more. The relief she knew was only temporary. Within several hours, her insatiable hunger would return, the longing, yearning desperation that screamed for arcane magic. After the Sunwell had been destroyed, there had been a vacuum, an emptiness within each and every one of the Blood Elves, which had grown steadily with time. None of her kind, not even Kael'thas, had foreseen the effect that the Sunwell's loss would have on them. At first, they did not understand the lethargy, the pervasive sickness that began to kill the very young and the very old. After all, they had destroyed the Sunwell. Surely they had eliminated the threat it had posed. Kael'thas, Rawmath, and Astalor studied the condition of the survivors carefully, and in time they arrived at the answer. The High Elves had spent generations bathed in the Sunwell's inexhaustible energies. Even when the Sunwell was tainted, it had still permeated them with magic. Detrimental and ruinous magic, certainly, but magic nonetheless. In the absence of any and all of the Sunwell's powers, the survivors were left empty, desolate, and desperate to replenish the magic that had once flowed through their veins. Over the years, they had grown addicted to that magic, and with the source of their addiction removed, the Blood Elves fought daily against the debilitating sickness that ensued. The Elves adapted as best they could. Kael'thas himself searched for an answer to the Blood Elves' dependence, willing to travel to the ends of the world and beyond. The prince had promised to bring an end to the Blood Elves' pain, to seek out a cure, or a suitable substitute for the powers of the Sunwell. To that end, he had allied with the wayward Night Elf Illidan against the Scourge following the Sunwell's destruction. But Kael'thas did so only after he and several of his volunteers had been ridiculed and marginalized by their allies, the human forces under the command of Grand Marshal Garathos. In the end, Kael'thas had turned to Illidan, dubbed the Betrayer by his own people. The prince had accepted Illidan's questionable methods as a last resort, yet it was Illidan who had shown Kael'thas how to siphon magic. Kael'thas had instructed others, and the knowledge was passed down until all Blood Elves had learned the techniques necessary to draw arcane energies from crystals, artifacts, creatures, or even mortals who commanded such power. So this clearly puts us after the events of the Frozen Throne. Ultimately, Kael'thas had followed the Betrayer into the world of Outland, the one-time home of the Orcs. There, Illidan had fought for supremacy, and now as Leadrin understood it, Illidan reigned supreme. Just what is Kael'thas' role in Illidan's affairs, Leadrin wondered. She worried that Illidan's influence over the prince was an unhealthy one, for this new lord of Outland embraced fell energies, the dark magic of demons, all corrupting and all consuming if the craving for it was not held in check. She worried, but such matters were beyond her control. Leadrin rose to the window and looked out onto the Ghostlands. Several miles south of where the outer gate had once stood, the Ghostlands were a barren, fallow expanse that many of her kind had formerly called home. Where immaculate elven estates had once risen, crumbling ruins now remained. Where lush forests had once dominated, withering arboreal phantoms now lingered. Gone were the vibrant colors that dazzled the eye, replaced by varying shades of gray. Gone were the halcyon days. Gone from here was the land of eternal spring. Yet it was in this desolate land, within this derelict manor, that Liadrin had dwelled for several weeks while she went about her work, dealing with her anger, her guilt, her regrets in the best way she knew how, by killing every agent of the scourge she could find. Liadrin scanned the tree line looking for any sign of movement, any sign of them. Even 5 years on, they persisted, an incurable disease. The most logical course of action, like with any other malignancy, was to carve out the offending tumor, to extirpate it fully. But to truly effect a lasting change, Liadrin knew that she would have to cut off the head of the serpent, to find the one who continued to propagate the ranks of the undead, the one who refused to die, the one who had been instrumental in her kingdom's downfall. Darkhan. Arthas himself was unreachable, sitting atop his icy throne at the roof of the world in the frozen continent of Northrend. The Death Knight had merged with his former master, the Lich King. The two had become one. For now, this new Lich King seemed content to wait in solitude, spreading his plague of undeath via his lieutenants in the field and their floating fortresses, the Necropoli. Liadrin sensed with general foreboding, however, that a much larger battle with the former Death Knight loomed in her people's future. Yet something else that is beyond my control, she thought. Far better to worry about the here and now. For years, she had tracked down and exterminated the undead wherever she could find them. She had aided her people in liberating the forests surrounding Silvermoon, Eversong Woods, from the Scourge, and when the others had chosen to focus on rebuilding, she had struck out on her own, vowing to destroy the Scourge forever, vowing to find the one who had betrayed them. But Lorthamar had found him first. 2 years ago, Lorthamar, Haldoran, and others, with the aid of blue dragons, had confronted the worm Darkhan at the site of the Sunwell. It was a clash that Lorthamar spoke little of on the rare occasions that she and he spoke. So that, I wonder... I don't remember that happening. Yet one thing that Lorthamar had been adamant about in the aftermath of the battle, the energies of the Sunwell had not been entirely lost. Somehow, in some form, the essence of the fountain endured, going through a kind of purification process, and when the time was right, the Sunwell would shine once again. You know what? I do think that we read about that in Chronicles, the different people that were trying to, where they made this fake person. To Liadrin, that all sounded well and good, but then Lorthamar had always been hopelessly optimistic. As for Darkhan, the cowardly wretch had supposedly been destroyed during the battle, but agents of the Scourge had an uncanny way of not staying dead. And so it was that when he resurfaced, Liadrin had begun tracking his movements. Of course, Darkhan had not persisted in life and death by being stupid. He managed to stay always one step ahead, always tantalizingly out of reach. It was as if he had eyes everywhere, watching, waiting. In the far south of the Ghostlands, at the base of the mountains, the Scourge had recently erected walls, fortifications, Stygian edifices of unguessable purpose, structures built of bone and iron, and behind it all, Liadrin sensed the hand of Darkhan, that's Deathholm. Meaning now, her best chance would be to take him by surprise, to catch him outside the walls of the citadel the Scourge had constructed. But in the past several weeks, she had witnessed undead flowing into the stronghold, not out of it. So for the time being, she remained content to exterminate the scattered agents that wandered through the dead forests, dreaming of the vengeance she would someday exact in the names of Vandalor, Belovir, and the multitude of elves who perished as a result of Darkhan's duplicity. In fact, it was the promise of his destruction that gave her reason to wake up each morning and face the sickness. It motivated her like no other want or need. Excuse me, guys. Just then a noise outside the doorway caught her attention. Someone or something approaching. Liadrin's hand shot to the nearest mace, her favorite weapon ever since the day of the Sunwell's extinguishment. She spun, mace drawn back, then lowered the weapon as Haldoran stepped into the room. "I did not mean to startle you," he offered sincerely. "I do not normally greet guests with a mace poised to crush their skulls," Liadrin replied evenly. "But your arrival was unannounced, and you rangers tend to tread softly." Haldoran smiled. "How have you been?" "Taking things one day at a time. How goes the restoration?" "It proceeds rapidly. More of Silvermoon is rebuilt every day. You can see for yourself, should you choose to accompany me." Liadrin's eyebrows rose questioningly. "Your presence has been requested by the Regent." "The Regent, you say? How is Lorthamar?" "Taking things one day at a time. A slight upturn tugged at Liadrin's lip. If I am gone, who will watch for the traitor? The forest riders will keep a sharp eye. If Darkon is detected, you will be notified immediately. You have my word. Through the doorway, she spied more of Haldoran's platoon. Perhaps removing herself from the situation temporarily and getting some proper rest would allow her to see more clearly, to devise a better strategy. Perhaps Lorthamar had gained some new knowledge that might assist her in her endeavor. And of course, it would be good just to see him again. You would be free to come back at any time, Haldoran added. Liadrin nodded. Very well then. Lead the way, Ranger General. Truly the golden spires of Silvermoon soared once again. The eastern half of the city was fully reclaimed and largely rebuilt, though the main gates in the city's western quadrants still lay mostly abandoned and in disrepair. Haldoran informed Liadrin that the entirety of Sunstrider Isle was now reclaimed as well, and was in fact thriving. Liadrin could not help but stare in genuine awe at how far the mending of the city had come as they approached the eastern gate. Just within the gateway, an enormous statue of Kael'thas stood against an inner wall. Haldoran indicated the statue as they passed the threshold and rounded the monument. It is called the Shepherd's Gate now, for it was through here that Kael'thas returned to us after the devastation. An identical statue stood on the other side of the wall, facing the city proper. Banners hung inside and outside the courtyard, raging fires burned in braziers beneath them. Liadrin could not help but think that the whole affair very closely resembled a shrine to some beloved deity. As they cleared the gate and ventured into Silvermoon along the Walk of Elders, Liadrin marveled at the spectacular sights she had feared never to see again. Tree-lined streets, ornate arches, floating urns, towering pinnacles, gilded balconies, gushing waterfalls. Silvermoon was beginning to feel like home again. It bustled, it pulsed, it breathed. Even the arcane patrollers had returned, magically powered walking constructs that acted as peacekeepers, defenders, sometimes public announcers. Yes, things in the city could almost pass for normal. Liadrin felt a warm satisfaction at the sight of it all. They made their way through the new Royal Exchange and up some shallow stairs that opened onto magnificent gardens in the Court of the Sun. They continued to the base of a colossal falcon wing-tipped spire. They proceeded through the entry, up a winding ramp, and through another archway to the inner sanctum. From there, Haldoran led Liadrin to what appeared to be a blank wall. He waved his hand over a nearby crystal, and a hidden doorway opened. He motioned for her to enter as he remained outside. Good day, Liadrin. Be well. With that, Haldoran departed. The study's decor was simple and functional. A bookshelf filled with tomes and grimoires, a desk and chair against one wall, a scrying stone in the near corner, and a large table with a long narrow box atop it in the center of the room. The motif did not appear to reflect Lorthamar's tastes, and in fact, the regent looked reasonably uncomfortable as he paced between the table and a darkened doorway beyond. Upon Liadrin's entrance, Lorthamar greeted her with a look and demeanor that seemed equal parts warm recognition and nervous apprehension. He managed to smile. I thought you might not come. A summons from the regent himself. How could I refuse? Lorthamar's good eye darted to the box on the table. Although I am happy to see you, it was in fact Ramath who summoned you. He has a proposal, something he and Astalor have managed to... The regent shot a glance toward the doorway behind him. I will let him give you the details. Mainly, I wanted to wish you well. Lorthamar rounded the table and drew closer to Liadrin, speaking in a quieter tone as if the walls were listening. Whether or not you accept his offer is of course up to you. His methods are not something I readily condone, but he has the full endorsement of His Highness Kael'thas. The regent's good eye locked on her with a demanding earnestness. I simply suggest that you go into this fully aware. Weigh the consequences carefully. Magic has never been my domain, but this business in particular. Just then a deep voice cut in from the doorway in the back of the room. So pleased you could join us, Liadrin. Ramath emerged from the darkened doorway, clothed in a crimson robe, his features below the eyes concealed by a high collar that reminded Liadrin uncomfortably of the scarf worn by Zul'jin. A green amulet shone from the Grand Magister's chest, and Liadrin felt immediate pangs of yearning for the arcane power it radiated. Lorthamar turned. I will leave you to your deliberations. He laid a hand briefly on Liadrin's shoulder. My door is always open to you. The regent departed. The hidden doorway slid shut behind him, leaving the former high priestess and the Grand Magister in silence. The lights seemed to dim. Romath's fiery green eyes fixed on Leadrin for several seconds. "I've been watching you for some time now. Figuratively, of course. Your reputation as a warrior has grown in the past several years. A rather unique evolution from your devout beginnings." Romath stepped farther into the room, approaching the table. The aura emanating from the amulet increasingly stirred Leadrin's cravings. She forced herself to ignore the hunger for magic that gnawed urgently, insistently at every fiber of her being. "Times change. People change," Leadrin replied. "Indeed." Romath stopped at the table and looked down at the box resting there. Leadrin's eyes locked once again on the amulet. Romath studied her for a moment, then reached up and removed the trinket from his neck. "Of course. How rude of me." The Grand Magister shuffled around the table, hand outstretched, amulet in his palm. "Be my guest." Leadrin felt a tingling over her skin as she fixated on the artifact's magical aura. "Are you certain you do not mind?" "Undoubtedly." Leadrin hesitated, then reached out and closed her hand over the bauble. Immediately she felt its arcane warmth rushing through her, lifting her. She reeled inwardly. The flow of intoxicating magic was then abruptly severed as Romath folded his fingers over the artifact and withdrew it. "It is a delicate equilibrium we blood elves must maintain, walking the line between deficiency and overindulgence." The Grand Magister returned to his spot before the table, donning the trinket once again. "Two extremes. Finding the common good, finding our balance, is what gives us purpose. Achieving that purpose is what makes us complete." Leadrin let out a deep breath, her face still flushed from the draining of the amulet. "Why am I here?" "Your life has been an exercise in extremes. Pious devotion to the light on one hand," Romath held out his right hand, palm up, "and the disciplined martial prowess of the warrior on the other." He raised and opened his left. "In that way you are unique among the elves, and well suited to the task I would set before you. But as I said," Romath brought both his hands together. The box on the table slid to the edge a few inches away from him. "We must all find balance." The Grand Magister's fingers fanned out. The clasp on the box opened, and the lid flipped up to reveal a lance-like object with a large crimson blade at one end, bristling with flat, spiked edges that resembled blazing tongues of flame. "What is this?" "Your weapon, should you choose to wield it. A blood-tempered ranseur." Leadrin reached out. Romath gestured, and the weapon leaped into her hand. It was well crafted, comfortable in her grip. Its length was reminiscent of the staff she had carried as a priestess, while the blade's heft approximated that of the truncheon she had grown used to wielding. It felt natural. The Grand Magister seemed to read her thoughts. "As I said, balance." Leadrin's eyes shot up. Romath was suddenly standing uncomfortably close. She could sense a smile behind the high collar as he continued. "Years ago, when you came to us with the knowledge of the Troll's impending attack, before we set out to extinguish our beloved Sunwell, you said something that has lingered in my memory. You said that the light was a fickle and worthless thing, that it failed to perform when most needed." Leadrin's green eyes held the Grand Magister's piercing gaze. "I remember." "Do you still feel this way?" "I do." Romath's hand reached up, fingers brushing the ranceur's flaring blades. "What if I told you there was a way to ensure that the light would heed you without fail? What if I told you that you could bend the light to your bidding, command it with a single thought, and manipulate it as easily as the weapon you hold in your hand?" "I would say it is impossible. None may command the light." Romath reached farther and laid a cold hand on Leadrin's shoulder. She recoiled slightly. "Impossible is only what we allow it to be. Come, there is something I wish to show you." Romath's hand grew warm as the core-wrenching sensation of his teleportation spell overcame her. The study disappeared and was steadily replaced by a different room. Leadrin spied a nearby access to an arched balcony. Transparent cloth billowed from the ingress. A soft, radiant glow bathed the curtain from beyond. For a dizzying second, Leadrin felt as if she were in a dream. What is this place? "We have not traveled far, just outside of Farstratus Square. Here my preeminent magi, led by Astalor, have spent a great deal of time striving to accomplish the impossible. And not long ago, Romath swept across the small space, brushed aside the curtain, and beckoned her. They succeeded." Leadrin felt the same sensation of floating through a dream as she stepped across the threshold and onto a balcony overlooking a much larger chamber. There she froze, mesmerized, and capable of speech, as she stared out at a luminous being hovering in the empty space, a living creature seemingly composed of pure energy. It glimmered and coruscated, bathing the cavernous chamber in its far-reaching light. Leadrin could make out fluctuating shapes that hinted at wings, but beyond that it was wholly unique, unfamiliar, and quite possibly the most beautiful sight she had ever beheld. It not only radiated light, but it radiated the light. Despite her long-time estrangement from it, she could feel the light washing over the room, touching each and every one of them. Across from the balcony, Leadrin spied another overlook where a mage stood channeling. From his hands, an undulating ribbon of arcane power stretched to the being. Leadrin's eyes shot to the floor, and there 2 more magi channeled similar forces into the entity. To her, those streams of power looked very much like magical chains. Near the 2 magi, Astalor waited. His gaze fell on Leadrin, and he nodded with a slight smile. Her eyes returned once more to the radiant being, and as before, she was instantly entranced. I have never seen anything like it. Again, Leadrin could sense Ramath smiling. Few have. The Grand Magister folded his arms across his chest, staring out proudly. It came to us from Outland, though it is not of that world. It was a gift, if you will, from His Highness. They captured it from an interdimensional fortress called Tempest Keep. It is called a Naru. This one in particular is named Muru. Muru, Leadrin repeated quietly. These beings, from what we can gather, are timeless, sentient, immensely powerful, and as you have no doubt felt, they are conduits of the light. Perhaps they are a kind of emissary of it. It was the prince's intention that we should drain this Naru of its powers, feed on it until nothing remained, but Astalor proposed an alternative. He and I summoned the most gifted of our magi, and we strove tirelessly to find a way to break this creature, to steal its power and subjugate it to our will. After many failed attempts and instances of nearly abandoning hope despite all setbacks, we finally succeeded. So this Naru will do as you command? Yes, and through it we may command the light. We need only a vessel, a willing participant, someone who possesses knowledge of the light, yet is free of the moral qualms associated with dominating it. Ramath's head turned to regard her. Someone who would use the power bestowed upon him or her to annihilate the enemies that stand before us, and teach others to do the same. That's messed up. If this is the origin of Blood Elf paladins, I don't see how, this is just straight evil. Leadrin's mind raced with the possibilities. What better way to avenge Vandalor, Bellavir, and the others than to use the light that had abandoned them to destroy their enemies? What better weapon to wield against the deceiver Darkhan? A weapon that she could wield on her own terms. She imagined an army of soldiers, all manipulating the light in ways none could have ever imagined. Yes, Leadrin stated decisively, I accept your offer, and if this process works as you say it will do, I do so gladly. Ramath nodded, unfolding his arms, and gestured. That same wrenching turbulence flooded her being, and an instant later she was on the floor of the room next to Astalor. Looking up now, she could see the glorious entity with greater clarity. Her heart skipped, and her breath caught in her throat. Standing in its shimmering radiance, she felt suddenly very small and insignificant. That is all about to change, she thought. Kneel and raise your weapon, Ramath instructed. Leadrin genuflected and lifted the rancier in both hands. Astalor rested one hand on her shoulder, the other he stretched out to Muru. Ramath did the same. Both men closed their eyes and whispered unfamiliar words in a language that seemed unfit for a mortal voice. Then all at once it happened. Time seemed to halt. The room fell silent. For a brief second she felt as if she were floating through a void. Then it hit her. When she had called upon the light as a high priestess, it had bathed her, filled her with its warmth, but this was wholly different. This felt as if it might rip her to pieces. This was like a straight-shot lightning bolt to the soul. For an instant it seemed as though her body were being pulled inside out. Then she heard within her head a kind of music, and she knew that the being, the Naru, was trying to communicate. Ramath and Astalor whispered again. Again she felt the lightning, and the tones within her head fractured into a screaming riot of noise, a sound of metal grinding against glass. The effect lasted for several seconds, and Liadrin was suddenly quite sure that her head would literally explode when the din immediately ceased. But that feeling, that charge of the light, remained. It was with her now, inextricably linked, hers to command. She could feel it coursing through her body like mercurial fire. Liadrin focused her thoughts, looked down at her hands, and smiled as the light's nimbus enveloped them. Rameth and Astalor let go of her shoulders. The Grand Magister stretched his arms out in a grandiose gesture, his eyes beaming proudly. I hereby name you foremost among our new order, Matriarch of the Blood Knights, warrior priestess of the Sin'dorei. Stand and be recognized, Lady Liadrin. 3 hammering blows pounded the door. Galel sat on the floor, knees tucked to his chest, arms drawn close to his body, trying to control the shivering fits that jostled him from head to foot. He found it extremely difficult to think clearly, but that was nothing new. He had spent the past few years in a kind of disconnected haze. In the early days of the elves' discovery of their magical addiction, Galel had learned rather quickly that strong doses of arcane magic served to induce an emotional numbness that the former priest found comforting. The magic tempered his nightmares and quieted his thoughts, his regrets. It distanced him from his despair. In the grip of the arcane, he felt almost nothing, and most times feeling nothing was preferable to the reality of his life. More blows hammered the door, louder, more insistent. A husky voice yelled from the other side, "Wake up, you worthless filth!" Unfortunately, his body had developed a resistance to the magic's effects. And so Galel relied upon increasing amounts of arcane energy, turning to sources honest elves shied away from. The shadowy inhabitants of Murder Row, whose methods of procurement and distribution were questionable to say the least. Even in his disconnected state, Galel was fully aware that he stood at a terrible threshold, that his physical and mental descent had now led him dangerously close to becoming one of the wretched, and he would not allow that to happen. "I will break it down, then," the voice shouted. Galel wished to bask in the light once again, but his saturation in magic and loss of mental acuity made such a feat seem impossible. He had not felt the light's touch in many years, and he had wandered so far from it now, he was unsure how he could possibly find his way back. The door burst open. Orovin stormed through, eyes wild. "Where is my money?" The crazed blood elf towered over Galel, his black hair hanging low over darkened leathers, fists clenching. He kneeled and inhaled sharply. His eyes briefly searched the room. He chuckled. "So, gone cold, have you? Good luck with that." The larger elf grasped Galel's collar and pulled the former priest close. "You still owe me, boy." "I intend to find work in the next few days." "See that you do." Orovin struck, landing a solid blow on Galel's cheek. "You have 1 more week. There's no gold in my palm at the end of it. I will hang your worthless corpse from the shepherd's gate." Orovin spat in Galel's face, rose, and kicked over the room's only table before exiting. Galel indeed hoped to find a new occupation in the next few days, but not for Orovin's benefit. This he had to do for himself. News had traveled quickly about the new order called the Blood Knights. Most spoke of them with a kind of revulsion, for it was said they stole the powers of the light from some otherworldly creature they kept in thrall. The most surprising revelation, at least to Galel, had come one day as he witnessed from his window a procession of the knights making its way through the city. Who led it but none other than Liadrin herself? He was stunned, but the sight of her and the knowledge of the Blood Knight's existence seemed to offer an opportunity for him, a chance to reconnect with the light. Not exactly in the manner he desired, perhaps, but the former priest feared that without the light's intervention, what was left of the man he had once been would be lost for good. And so he had ceased his intake of magic completely. That cessation had made him gravely ill, but it was imperative that he hold out long enough to clear his head, to rise above the physical, mental, and emotional wreck he had become so that he might competently plead his case to Liadrin. It was imperative because he truly felt it might be his last chance to start a new life. The team still had much to learn, yet Liadrin could not help but be impressed by how far its members had come in the past several weeks. Also, over the past several weeks, she found herself asking why anyone would go back to the old ways. Why be a servant of the light when you could be its master? Why fumble for something that remained constantly out of reach when you could grasp it firmly and force your will upon it. Her mount, a purebred Thalassian charger, shifted its weight anxiously. She turned to the south. From her position atop the bluff, she could see the darkened blight of the Ghostlands in the distance. That was her objective. That was where Darkhan waited. I just got it. Quelt the Loss is where Thalassian comes from, so it's basically High Elven, kind of / Blood Elven. All in due time. Think about the here and now. Think about what you can control. For now, Lady Liadrin was content to train her army. And what better way to train them than by ridding their lands of the foul wretched here at the abandoned port of Sunsail Anchorage? Desperate and demented criminals, the wretched had siphoned arcane magic in amounts exorbitant enough to physically transform them into emaciated, reckless, black-hearted fiends who would gladly kill for a few mana crystals. While pitiful, they were also too violent and senseless to surrender, hence they tended to put up a good fight. A fitting test for her fledgling knights. As one of the men below called out for help, Liadrin reminded herself that the wretched were a threat not to be taken too lightly. She spurred her mount down off the bluff to observe the battle. Half-submerged ships, some of them dating back to the Second War, still populated the harbor, their bowsprits and broken masts jutting out of the shallow water at steep angles like thrusting spears. One ship, a merchant vessel, had remained intact. It was on the main deck of the ship that Vranesh was besieged on all sides by the crazed wretched. 6 of them hiding in the hold. Would it kill you, dim-witted plebeians, to provide some assistance? Vranesh was arrogant and aloof even for an elf, but he was committed and a skilled fighter. While his attackers carried simple clubs and maces, Vranesh wielded a lance, similar in size and feel to the Ransuer he would receive upon attaining the rank of adept. He struck out and opened wide gashes in 2 of his assailants. "We are a bit busy at the moment," Solinar called down. Liadrin's eyes shot to the top of the lookout tower. Solinar kicked one of the wretched off the open balcony. The body flew down and by some gruesome act of misfortune was neatly impaled on one of the broken masts. Solinar had been one of the first to volunteer for the Blood Knights. Like many Blood Elves, he had changed his surname to honor the fallen. In Solinar's case, the name change held the additional import of honoring his brother. Liadrin felt his new surname, Bloodwrath, was a fitting tribute. Above, Solinar turned to face 2 more combatants. I feel like that name Solinar is in World of Warcraft. Sissa had also gained the top floor, however, and was eager to show her mettle. She shouted a loud cheer as she swung, channeling the light through her lance, dropping the 2 attackers to their knees. As one of them drew a dagger and attempted to stand, Sissa decapitated him with a fervor that bordered on glee. "Hold strong, Vranesh. I shall make haste." Elar Dawnblade rushed out from the bottom floor of the tower in a headlong charge toward the ship. Melar had been a paladin under the legendary human Uther the Lightbringer, and was a veteran of many battles with the Scourge. He blamed Uther for many things, however, including the fall of Quel'Thalas. Melar was certainly a straight arrow, a sterling example of moral rectitude. Although Liadrin did not necessarily agree with his theories, she admired his conviction. "Never mind, I will handle this myself." On board the merchant vessel, Vranesh kneeled. A blinding light enveloped him, then blasted out from his body, launching the remaining 4 wretched into the water. Bocce and Bloodvalor, who hated to be called by his first name, and in fact refused to divulge it to most, rushed up the coast. "All clear along the banks," Bloodvalor announced. Bocce, known to be fearless, if not perhaps slightly unhinged, dove into the water to attack the wretched displaced by Vranesh. Rapid footfalls sounded just behind Liadrin's position. She twisted as she brought her horse around and raised her Ransuer. She felt the light well within her. There was that brief but now familiar riot of noise inside her head as she channeled the light through the Ransuer and into the attacking wretched leader, catapulting him back into the tree he had been hiding behind. His body rebounded from the massive trunk and fell hard, face first, onto the small section of wooden fence bordering the road. Liadrin spurred her horse, pulled alongside him, and plunged her Ransuer into the slumped form. Melar, who had halted his rush to aid Vranesh, ran up, lance ready. Are there more of them? The next feeble-minded urchin who attacks you shall answer to me, fair lady." "Rest easy, Melar. That was the last of them." Liadrin raised a hand to her throbbing temple. The headaches were the worst part, and channeling the light in an effort to mitigate them only seemed to increase their frequency and severity. "My lady, are you unwell?" am fine. Solinar and Sissa had reached ground level and were approaching, as were the others, including a very wet but smiling nonetheless Bachi. Vranesh was the last to arrive. Vranesh! I know, lady, I should have checked the hold. Yes, you should have checked the hold. And Solinar, you should have waited for Sissa. Do not rush ahead of your partner. Solinar nodded. The errors you committed here today are symptoms of the greater affliction, a lack of unity. You all still behave and act as individuals, mindless of the fact that you are now part of something greater. You're a team. Acting as anything less will only serve to get you killed. Liadrin retrieved her lance. Now, let us see about cleaning up this garbage. Despite the service the Blood Knights provided, the mood of the people had not changed. Liadrin had hoped that once the citizens got past their initial objection to the Order's methodology, once they saw the good her team could do, perhaps the people would accept the Blood Knights, maybe even embrace them. But now, as Liadrin led the team through the bazaar, she noted the same scornful glances, fearful stares, and careful avoidance as before. Not exactly a hero's welcome, Solinar observed, walking alongside Liadrin's charger. No, he was right. Nothing had changed. The reception did not differ in Farstrider's Square as Liadrin and the Blood Knights made their way to the lodgings that had become their headquarters. Just outside the building, Sissa stopped. Her eyes swept the onlookers. What is wrong with all of you? Can you not see that we fight to keep you safe? Most of the observers turned and went about their business. A few stared back defiantly. Liadrin dismounted and handed the reins to Sissa. Give them time, she said. Disgusted, Sissa led the charger off to be stabled. Once inside the Blood Knight headquarters, Liadrin unclasped her armor and set her rancier in a rack against a far wall. It felt good to be back, to relax, to breathe freely. When I was very young, my friends and I used to play a game. Liadrin recognized the voice immediately. She smiled and turned to see Galel standing just inside the entry. He looked thin and slightly pale, and he had a nasty bruise on his cheek, but he still appeared far more vibrant than the last time she had seen him. In the early days of the reconstruction, Galel had been mostly quiet and withdrawn, and she had worried for him. She had asked several more times about how he had escaped his bonds that day in the troll lair, mainly just to get him talking. He had always given his standard reply, What fun would it be if there were no mysteries between us? A game called Captive, Galel continued. One of us would play the captive. The others would tie him up and leave until the captive managed to get free. Each of us took turns, and the one who worked free in the least amount of time won. Liadrin crossed the floor and embraced her old friend. I was the best at it. That day in the troll's den, I thought back to my childhood and I imagined I was playing the game. It took a bit more time than when I was young, but I managed to work free. Liadrin smiled and shook her head. So that was it? That was the trick you've been hiding from me all these years? Galel nodded. Now at last there are no more mysteries between us. Still smiling, the Blood Knight matriarch stared at him for a long moment. And what of the crystals left at my doorstep while I was away in the Ghostlands? Crystals? Do not deny it. You've been caught. I meant to find you and express my gratitude, and here you have saved me the trouble. But Shh. Liadrin moved a finger to his lips. Tell me, how have you been? The truth, Galel hesitated. I've not been myself for a long time. I felt lost and alone. Gently, Liadrin laid her palm on Galel's cheek. You were never alone. A glow washed over her hand, and the bruise disappeared. And who among us has not felt lost these last few years? Galel smiled, glad to feel the light once again, if only briefly. His hand closed over Liadrin's. I wish to know the light's warmth as in times past, I thought. It is no longer something I can do on my own. I came to ask for your help. Liadrin lifted an eyebrow. You wish to use our methods to reconnect with the light. Our interaction with it is not so much warmth. Liadrin looked in the direction of the underground chamber where Maru was kept. It is a struggle, and a constant one at that. But Galel was adamant. I believe this may be my best chance to reclaim the person I was before. I believe the light will show me the way, even if I must force it to do so. Are you certain of this sentiment? Yes. Silence stretched between them as the matriarch considered. She was not sure that Galel was Blood Knight material. Everyone knew what he had been through, what he had survived, what he never spoke of, the sinking of the merchant ships, the passing of the children. Liadrin often wondered how deeply that day had scarred him. If I do not give him a chance, who will? Liadrin sighed. Are you prepared to be looked down upon, misunderstood, and ostracized by your own brethren? I will suffer whatever I must to regain control of my life. Are you willing to maintain the discipline and the training that will be required of you? Are you willing to do exactly as I say? Yes, without hesitation. Liadrin contemplated. She was still unsure. I need this, Liadrin. All or none, right? He had demonstrated such courage in the Troll's lair, and when it had come time to destroy the Sunwell, he had been there, fighting at their sides. All of that had to be worth something. Yes, all or none, Liadrin answered finally. Come with me, then. Astalor has something to show you. Days passed. Liadrin found herself in the Ghostlands once again. This time, however, she was not alone. She looked to her right, where Solinar waited astride a charger of his own. He wore the tabard now of the Blood Knights, a fiery phoenix against a field of black. She observed the others. Vranesh, Sissa, and Bachi would advance from adepts to proper knights before long, yet they still acted as individuals and not as a cohesive unit. And then there was Galel. She scanned the darkened glade and finally spotted him farther back near the tree line. Although he had demonstrated his determination in the last several days, he had not made an effort to integrate with the team. She had witnessed the bliss in his eyes upon his exposure to Maru, and in that moment she briefly saw again the old Galel, the confident, unshakable Galel. He trained vigorously but quietly. He kept mostly to himself, and the others thought him peculiar. In the past 2 days he had seemed to withdraw even more, and Liadrin worried. She wondered if she had made the right decision by allowing him to join. The initiate phase was a period of adjustment, she reminded herself. Give him time. All clear, my lady, Melar reported, approaching from the north. Bloodvalor emerged from the woods to the south. Likewise, he added. Liadrin nodded. There were no Scourge in the area, and that was good, but these days it was not Scourge alone they had to watch out for. Bands of trolls had been witnessed streaming into Zulaman in the past few weeks, and many had been seen scouting ruins near the team's current location as well. She looked at the structure before them and wondered if they might finally be drawing closer to ensnaring Darkhan. Though all of the estates in the Ghostlands had fallen to ruin, Dawnstar's spire seemed relatively unaffected by time. The towering edifice, situated atop a shelf at the foot of the mountains just east of Lake Elrondar, might pass as inhabited to the unknowing observer. The unkempt grounds were close enough to Eversong woods that some plant life had begun to re-emerge, and the tower itself gleamed as it stretched into the night sky. There, Liadrin glimpsed majestic turrets that appeared to float around the central spire. Indeed, for a derelict shell at the outer edge of a dead land, the property cast an illusion of being in mint condition. The estate had in fact once been the home of Darkhan. It was here that he had spent his childhood, and it was here in recent days that the Farstriders had witnessed increased Scourge activity. It was some kind of sign. It had to be. Had Darkhan finally slipped up? Liadrin certainly hoped so. Let us have a look inside. The inside of the manor was much like the outside, in a nearly pristine state. Furniture lined the walls, banners emblazoned with the Silver Moon City emblem hung from the surrounding pillars. A crystal chandelier hovered high above, encircled by a winding staircase. Vranesh went about searching. What exactly are we looking for? I wish I knew, Liadrin replied. Something out of place, some hint as to why the Scourge have taken a sudden interest in this location after all this time. Bloodvalor and Bachi ascended the staircase. Galel stopped walking, holding his hand to his head. What is it, Galel? Liadrin asked. Just the headaches. I will be fine. He offered Liadrin a faint smile, a futile attempt at reassurance. The headaches seemed to affect Galel more than the others, and Liadrin could not help but wonder why. She had always thought that the younger man lived more within his own head than among the outside world. Perhaps the headaches really were hitting him harder. Yet another reason he might not be fit for service. Look at the carpet, Sissa pointed down at the outer edge of a massive circular carpet that lay beneath them. Indeed, a crease crossed the periphery, as if the carpet had been pulled away and hastily replaced. The others stepped aside. Liadrin reached down and pulled back the carpet to reveal a square-cut trap door beneath. Well done, Sissa. Looks as if you found something. Liadrin kneeled, flipped the latch, and lifted the door. Within a small recess sat a worn, leather-bound journal. Pressed between the pages was a sheet of parchment, not yellow like the journal's leaves, but white. "What is it?" Sissa drew close. Galel approached. Leadrin unfolded the parchment to discover a message written in symbols she could not recognize. A clue, perhaps. When Leadrin had entered Lorthamar's quarters, the regent had been busily fletching an arrow. His project lay discarded now at the side of the table as he transcribed the message from Dawnstar's spire onto a new sheet of parchment. Shafts of light from the afternoon sun streamed in through the open balcony. Leadrin glanced about the room. On a nearby desk she spied a letter with a broken seal. Intriguingly, the seal bore the insignia of the Horde. "It looks like a code to my untrained eye," Lorthamar announced. "If it is, perhaps one of our scribes will be capable of deciphering it. In the meantime," he folded the old parchment, replaced it in the journal, then shut the book and handed it to Leadrin. "I suggest returning this to its place and keeping watch on the spire." Leadrin nodded. "Agreed." Lorthamar sighed, examined one of the arrows he had been working on, then fixed his eye on her. "I had my reservations, about this new order. I still do, truth be told, but..." Lorthamar's eye shot to the letter on the desk. "In light of recent events, maybe it's not such a bad thing." "What recent events are those?" "I have been in correspondence with Thrall and Sylvanas." Leadrin felt her heart catch at the mention of the former Ranger General. It was widely known that Sylvanas now commanded a force of undead allied with the Horde, called the Forsaken. Sylvanas had broken free of Arthas's control over her, but she had a long way to go before gaining any kind of trust in Leadrin's eyes. Whether or not a trace of the noble and stout-hearted elf endured within the Queen of the Forsaken remained to be seen. "And what business have they with us?" Lorthamar stood and crossed to the desk. "We are in preliminary discussions aimed at the possibility of the Cinderai aligning with the Horde." Leadrin stayed silent, considering. "Well, our Calderai cousins would most certainly be surprised." Lorthamar turned. "Very true, but times change. People change," the matriarch added, echoing the words she had spoken to Ramath not so long ago. "The reputation of your blood knights has reached all the way to Durotar. I think that your new order has made the prospect of an alliance with the Blood Elves far more tempting. Though I was doubtful in the beginning, I now believe it possible that someday soon you and your knights may accomplish something outstanding. And if you do, I believe it may be enough to sway Thrall's mind." "Let the people scorn us, then," Leadrin thought. "Darkhan," she said aloud. "Pardon? Darkhan will die either way. If his elimination aids our standing with potential allies, then so much the better." "Would that I could kill him myself," Lorthamar replied grimly. "I believed him dead once already, but..." He looked suddenly very tired. "You should get some rest. I will check back tomorrow." Leadrin started to leave. "I heard Galel has joined your ranks. How fares our old friend?" Leadrin contemplated before answering. "He is adjusting, I think. I will tell him you said hello." The matriarch gave a final nod as she exited the room. The ranger took his fletching materials from the table to the desk and opened a small drawer. Several arcane crystals lay within. Lorthamar himself did not have as much need for them as his brethren did. In fact, the rangers in general seemed less affected by magical dependence and withdrawal, though Lorthamar was unsure why. He knew that other blood elves were not so lucky, however, and he had tasked Haldoran with surreptitiously leaving crystals for Leadrin during her time living in the Ghostlands. Times changed, people changed, but there were some things, like Lorthamar's admiration and affection for Leadrin, that over the years had remained very much the same. 3 hammering blows pounded the door. Galel lay in the center of the room, and it seemed as if the pounding on the door echoed the hammering within his skull. The former priest reached out and grasped one of the crystals he had taken from Dawnstar's spire. He gripped it tight, shut his eyes, and felt the headache slowly subside as the magic surged within him. Over the past few days, Galel had noted that magical intake helped relieve the headaches, but each time the amount of magic required to achieve even a small measure of relief increased. There had also been blackouts, periods for which he had no memory. Not for the first time, Galel felt as if his hold on sanity might be slipping. He had gotten what he wanted, the ability to command the light. He could manipulate the light against his foes, he could heal his wounds and the wounds of others, but he could not force the light to drive the bitterness from his heart, and the headaches and the nerve-fraying, cacophonous noise that invaded his mind were excruciating reminders of his inability to do so. The hammering on the door grew louder. Orovin shouted, "Your time has come! Wake up, you vermin!" Galel had to continue trying. He simply had not learned enough to control the light properly yet. He needed more time, but he also needed to clear his thoughts, and it seemed that the crystals posed the only solution, at least for now. The door rocked on the verge of smashing apart. Galel snatched up a nearby sack, whipped the door open, and clasped his hand around Orvin's throat, driving him against the far side of the hall, channeling the strength of the light into his grip, trying desperately to ignore the clash of discordant noise within his head as he did. He shoved the sack of gold into the taller elf's face. "Half of this is what I owe you. The other half is for the new crystals you will bring tomorrow morning. Only the finest quality. Do we have an understanding?" Orvin's wide eyes were fearful as he sputtered hoarsely, "I see no reason we cannot do business." Late the following afternoon, Liadrin rode out with Solinar to the Ghostlands to relieve Vranesh, Melar, and Galel near the spire. The 3 men had spent the day watching for activity. By the time the two had made their way into the withered forest, the sun was casting its final rays. Melar was resting against a deadfall when they approached. "Anything?" Liadrin called out. "Silent as the grave, my lady," Melar replied. Just then Vranesh emerged from behind a nearby wagon, adjusting his chain leggings. "Where is Galel?" The 2 men looked at each other. Vranesh spoke first. "Not my responsibility. I was answering nature's urgent call." Melar shrugged. "He has wandered off several times throughout the day, acting peculiar, I would say." Vranesh huffed. "With him, peculiar seems to be the norm." "This is just the sort of thing I have been talking about," Liadrin admonished him. "Being part of a team means looking out for each other. Neither of you should have ever let him out of your sight." Just then a blood-curdling scream rolled across the lake, echoing through the mountains. Whether it was Galel's voice or not, Liadrin could not tell. "Spread out," Liadrin ordered. The Blood Knights complied. The matriarch guided her horse as quickly as possible through the dense woods to the south along the foothills. She soon stopped near a crushed thicket where a circle of dark blood coated the ground. Liadrin looked farther south to the nearest hillock. More blood, barely visible in the waning light. She spurred on her horse, and as she did so, the volume of blood covering the ground and the surrounding brush and trees grew alarmingly. "Knights to me!" Liadrin shouted. As she continued, Liadrin began to see pieces, body parts. If they were human, elf, or other, she could not tell. She followed the grisly trail farther, spotting a severed limb, an arm. Its skin was dull green. The charger crested another hillock, and Liadrin looked down into a small clearing where Galel sat amid a morass of viscera and limbs. A troll head lay in front of him. Galel rocked back and forth, his hands digging into his own skull. He was covered as if painted in blood. Liadrin leaped from her horse and held Galel close. Solinar, Melar, and Vranesh rushed onto the gruesome scene. "You should have never let him out of your sight!" She turned and screamed to Vranesh and Melar. "I'm sorry, my lady. We had no idea," Melar offered. "Did you do this?" Liadrin asked Galel. The only answer was a long moan. "We had no idea," Melar repeated, his mouth hanging open as he surveyed the carnage. "I must get him back to Silvermoon. Melar, Vranesh, Solinar will wait with you until I have sent others. Be vigilant. Now help me lift him onto the horse." "How is he?" Orthamar inquired from his table. "Resting. Did he tell you what happened?" Liadrin sat on a chair near the doorway. Much of the troll's blood had transferred from Galel onto her in the process of getting the former priest mounted. "Only that he was beset by a troll scout in the woods, but that does not explain. He has said that he has been thinking a great deal lately of that time long ago in the lair. He has not been himself." Orthamar's heartfelt concern was evident both on his face and in his voice as he responded. "I will look in on him. As for right now, there is a matter of urgency. The purpose of my sending for you." The regent uncovered a sheet of parchment. "Astalor deciphered the code," he announced, and picked up the parchment and read out loud. "The stones of light, fire, and what remains of spark will be delivered to you when day and night are equal. The missive is signed Thadir." "Tomorrow night is the equinox," Liadrin observed. "But what stones does this refer to?" Orthamar replaced the parchment on the table. "Belavir imbued 3 stones with energies from the Sunwell during the Troll Wars. The stone of spark was shattered in that time, but Belavir kept the fragments along with the other 2 stones in the Magister's terrace on Quel'Danas. We have been searching the remains near the Sunwell, but so far with no luck. If the stones still exist, they can be used to repel the undead. Darkhan is no doubt aware of this and wants to secure the stones so they cannot be used against him. Any idea who this Thadir may be? Lorthmar only shook his head. Whoever he is, it sounds as if he located the stones before us and now plans to deliver them to Darkhan, Liadrin offered. Yes, a delivery, not a transaction. That suggests to me. There was a knock at the door. Enter, the regent called. Haldoran stepped in. Sorry to disturb, but there is a matter to report. Lorthamar nodded. We are just finishing. He returned his attention to Liadrin. This suggests to me that your mystery guest will not be meeting with Darkhan directly, but rather will be leaving the stones where you found the journal. Then the Blood Knights will be waiting for him or her. This may be just the accomplishment you and I had discussed, a way for us to tip the scales favorably in your ongoing negotiations. I think you might be right. Liadrin stood and prepared to leave. You might want to hear this as well, Haldoran offered. A party of Alliance treasure seekers infiltrated Zulaman. Almost all were killed. One of them managed to escape and was found dying by my platoon. He spoke of dark rituals, animal gods, and profane sacrifices. He also spoke a single name over and over again before his final breath. Zuljin. Lorthamar looked to Liadrin. After a moment of silence, he exhaled heavily. I suppose it was only a matter of time before that vulture returned to his nest. Haldoran appeared deeply troubled, and Liadrin thought of the night Zuljin had escaped. She decided it was best to leave the two alone. I will update my knights. Come tomorrow, you will have the stones. Liadrin gave a nod to Haldoran on her way out the door. Lorthamar rose and walked out onto the balcony overlooking the court of the sun. A cool wind blew in, stirring the fletching materials on the desk, sweeping a feather to the floor. Haldoran reached down and retrieved it, rubbed it between his fingers. You miss it, do you not? The life of a ranger. Lorthamar continued looking out over the city as he answered. More so every day. Sometimes I feel as if the walls are closing in. The forests call to me, brother. Bow in hand, warm sun on my skin, promises of adventure whispered on the wind. No walls, no schedules to keep. That is when I am most alive. I envy you your freedom. Haldoran realized that it was not the city Lorthamar stared out at, but that he dreamed of the forests beyond the walls. There is something I must tell you. Haldoran's voice was heavy as he joined Lorthamar on the balcony. During the Second War, when we had captured Zuljin in the forests, though my men tortured him, I made the decision to keep him alive because I wanted you to be the one to decide his fate. I had the chance to kill him then, and I did not. It was a foolish mistake, and because of me, he's lived on to menace us once again. Lorthamar turned and clapped his hand on Haldoran's shoulder. I of all people know what it is to harbor guilt, Haldoran. It was my disclosure, after all, that provided Darkhan with the knowledge necessary to open the door to Arthas, to visit destruction upon our kingdom. But you could not have known, Haldoran protested immediately. Exactly my point. Guilt, regret, despair, they will take up residence deep within and consume you in time if you let them. I carry the guilt of my failure every day. How do you overcome it? Haldoran persisted. I refuse to let my feelings interfere with the weight of my responsibility, and I hold fast to a single fragment of hope, the belief that our shared hardship will unite us. Lorthamar turned and looked out once again, his gaze no longer distant but fixed on Silvermoon. That our kingdom will not only regain its former glory, but surpass it. That we will all learn from our mistakes. True leadership is not about making the right decisions every time. Sometimes it is about pressing on despite having made the wrong ones. You did what you thought best, and you have served Quel'Thalas with unwavering courage and integrity. Lorthamar's eye fell on Haldoran, his tone conveying his sincerity. And throughout all we have endured, you have remained my most loyal and trusted comrade. Relief washed over Haldoran's features. A fragment of hope, he confirmed. I shall hold to that as well. Your parents would be ashamed of what you have become. They would understand I've done what I thought best. You've only succeeded in hiding your fear, Your pride will be the downfall of the ones you love. I will not listen to you. I renounce you. You cannot run from your sins. You will be silent. I command it. As you command the light. Just so. Now be gone. You no longer hold sway over me. Liadrin awoke to a hammering on her door. She opened it to find Vranesh on the other side. He looked alarmingly pale. There is something you must see. An enormous crowd had gathered just inside the shepherd's gate. Vranesh and Liadrin fought through to the front where a view of Kael'thas' statue opened before them. A bloodied corpse hung there, head lolling forward from a broken neck, arms outstretched and tied with a cord to the statue's chiseled spaulders. Who is he? Liadrin asked. Some lowlife from Murder Row. Orovin, I think they said his name was. But there are rumors. Just then one of the spectators turned, pointing. It was one of you that did it! I know nothing of this, Liadrin shot back. The crowd began to push forward. Several guardians rushed in to restore order. Another forged a path through the unruly mob to address Liadrin. Lady, the Grand Magister would like a word. Romath's eyes burned brightly. One of yours. He was seen hanging the body in the middle of the night. Liadrin could feel waves of oppressive energy radiating from the Grand Magister. His anger was palpable. Vranesh had confided in her that it was indeed Galel whom many had identified as the killer, but that was impossible. Galel could never. We are in discussions to ally with the Horde. Liadrin thought about telling Romath that she knew this information already, and then she decided not to. A debacle such as this could jeopardize everything. Guardians and patrollers searched the kingdom and could find no trace of this. Galel, Liadrin offered, but there must be some mistake. Galel is not a murderer. Perhaps it was self-defense. There is no mistake, Romath spat. He has disappeared. Innocent elves do not run and hide, and those who have killed in defense do not publicly display their act for all to see. Romath's eyes had flared. They dimmed now slightly. I must leave shortly to deliver a report to His Highness in Outland on the status of our negotiations. I want you to find this Galel, and I expect the situation to be remedied by the time I return tomorrow. Other matters have arisen that demand. Romath disappeared, then reappeared inches from her. Liadrin backed up a step. I demand that you find this rogue operative, and when you do, I expect you to utilize any means necessary to bring closure to this issue. That is what I demand. What are you suggesting? The Grand Magister's voice dropped by several degrees. Whatever it takes. Liadrin's mind reeled. Surely such steps would not be necessary. Surely she could just retrieve Galel, uncover the truth, assist him in seeking the proper help, assuming she could find him. But the more she thought on it, the more convinced she became that she knew where he had run to. Do it swiftly and do it quietly. The future of our people may depend on it. Can I entrust you with this? Liadrin hesitated. Can I entrust you with this? Yes. Romath gestured. The door behind Liadrin slid open. Good. Do not prove my faith in you to have been unfounded. Now go. The moon cast a warm glow on Dawnstar Spire. Soft white light radiated from the marble walls. The moonlight did not penetrate as easily the boughs of the skeletal tree where Vranesh shifted uncomfortably, muttering, Mind yourself, Bachi. You are working into my space. And just what are you insinuating? Trust me when I say I do not find you attractive, Bachi retorted. Silence, both of you. Your voices carry. This last was from Solinar, who had been given charge of the knights in Liadrin's absence. While he, Vranesh, and Bachi kept watch from the south, Sisset, Melar, and Bloodvalor held vigil in a sublocation just to the north. Between the two positions, they would have a clear view of anyone entering or leaving Dawnstar Spire. Liadrin had been evasive when asked why she must leave. She had seemed preoccupied, unsettled, stating only that she had urgent business and that she held faith in the knight's ability to handle a single scourge agent, who or whatever it may be. Still, she had advised them to assess the threat before taking any action, and if they deemed the danger to be too great, to stay their hands. Gossip among the knights regarding Galel had of course run rampant. Some blamed an imbalance of magical intake, others held that it was the power of the light, the shattered voice of Meru, that had driven him mad. They all suffered their own headaches, tried their best to shut out the riotous discord that bombarded their skulls when they channeled the Naru's powers, and though they did not speak of it openly, each and every one of them had felt at one time or another that if the cacophony could not be arrested, his or her sanity might someday be suspect. Galel's sudden descent seemed to have unnerved Sissa in particular. She had withdrawn slightly, not quite the same brash, vibrant elf she had been. Solinar worried about the effect Galel's breakdown would ultimately have on the team, but for now he did his best to keep everyone focused on the task at hand. Bachi reached over, tapped Solinar on the shoulder, and pointed out to the lake where a huddled figure rode tender across the moonlit waters. Vranesh stared openly, for his eyes, just like the eyes of any blood elf, could discern the aura of arcane magic surrounding the hooded form. Once to the shore, the stranger stood, clutching a small chest.
"By the well, do you see it? A powerful energy. It must be the stones."
"Quiet," Solinar snapped. The figure stepped out of the boat, holding the chest close, slowly progressing up the hill. Much to Solinar's relief, Vranesh and Bachi managed to stay quiet. Within a few moments, the stranger had ventured through the spire's entryway.
"Tonight we secure not only the stones, but perhaps a prisoner with knowledge of the Scourge's operations. The time has come. Signal the others we strike now."
Lorthamar was still in a state of disbelief. Galel accused of murder? Could he have truly fallen so far? Lorthamar had not visited his friend as he had hoped to do. Too many matters that demanded his attention, too many balls to juggle as usual. If he had made the time to visit, could he have changed anything? The regent wondered how Liadrin must be handling this. After all, it was she who had inducted him into the order. She who, an urgent rapping at the door, interrupted Lorthamar's thoughts.
"Enter."
The door opened and a mage walked in, carrying a lockbox that looked as if it had been through a war. Next to the doorway came Astalor, who seemed uncharacteristically anxious.
"I ordered this brought to you as soon as I realized. If only Rawmath were here. What is it?"
The mage pushed aside Lorthamar's fletching materials with the edge of the box as he placed it on the table.
"It was found in the ruins several hours ago, far from the site of Belavir's old quarters, in an area we had not uncovered yet. It must have been displaced in the blast."
Astalor gestured, and the lid of the box flipped open. Lorthamar could sense the powerful emanations as he drew close and observed 2 aqua-colored stones. Fragments of a third lay in a pile between them. The stones of light and fire, and what remained of the stone of spark.
"I do not know what stones our Thadir agent possesses, but they are certainly not these. Which leads me to 2 conclusions. 1, he acquired similar stones in his mistaken as to their identity, or 2, Thadir is lying."
Lorthamar retrieved one of the jagged fragments of the stone of spark, and though he was not as attuned to the powers of the well as some, he could feel the arcane energy suffusing him.
"Lying, yes, but why?"
To entrap Darkhan, perhaps. The regent set the fragment back on the table and hurriedly fished out the copy he had made of the letter. If what he suspected was correct, Lorthamar grabbed a nearby stylus and quickly rearranged the letters beneath the signature. Thadir. He cursed himself for a fool as he worked out the simple anagram and wrote Drathir. If only he had not been so preoccupied with the unfolding horde situation, he might have realized sooner. It was a ruse, Astalor, that much is true, but not meant to entrap Darkhan. The regent knew the name Drathir all too well. It was Darkhan's surname.
Thadir is Darkhan.
Rage boiled up within him, rage directed at both Darkhan and himself. Lorthamar snatched the stone of spark fragment from the table.
"And the trap is meant for us."
Darkhan commended himself on a plan well executed. Once the master had learned of the Blood Knight's existence, he had commanded the mage to eliminate this new threat and press the knights into the ranks of the Scourge. No small task. Darkhan had needed to figure out a way to draw the order into a trap of his devising. He had considered many methods to accomplish this goal. One by one he had discarded each scheme. He had asked the master for guidance, and then he had remembered the stones. After all, Darkhan had eyes and ears everywhere, and he knew that the stones had not yet been retrieved. He knew also that the temptation would be too much for Lorthamar and Liadrin to resist. He knew that if they believed the threat to be minimal, the work of a single agent, they would let down their guard. It was so convenient to be able to depend upon the predictability of his dear old friends. The master was pleased, and the plan was set into motion. The mage smiled as he remembered the looks on their faces when the knights had burst in on his ostensibly depositing the stones in the hideaway. They
It seemed so confident at first until Darkhan had removed his hood and the host of minions that had been hiding among the foothills poured into the great room. How surprised the fools had all been. The moment was truly priceless. Now nearby, one of the knights, presumably a leader judging by his tabard, dispensed with the skeletal warriors surrounding him and made a move to attack. Darkhan gestured and whispered an incantation, and the overzealous knave crumpled to the floor and writhed in pain. If not for the Farstrider's intervention, the Blood Knights would have all been dead already. Haldoran and his platoon had arrived just after the trap was sprung. The battle had spilled out onto the outer grounds where the Rangers were fighting valiantly, but that, of course, only delayed the inevitable. Another knight, a female, had gained the upper hand on her attackers. Darkhan flicked his fingers outward and channeled his shadow powers into the fragile vessel of the woman's body, which was flung upward and into the winding staircase with enough force to break several bones. The woman fell immediately unconscious, and that simply would not do. What fun was that? Darkhan wanted to make sure she was fully lucid when she died. The mage had hoped Liadrin would be among her flock. She still hoped she might show, perhaps try one last desperate offensive before her downfall. How glorious it would be to take her corpse to his citadel of Deathholm, and there raise her into the service of the Lich King. What a boon for the Master if Liadrin herself would lead her undead knights in a siege of Silvermoon. Just then one of Darkhan's invisible agents, one of his shades, fed him an image of what transpired outside. Guardians had arrived, teleported by one whom Darkhan did not immediately recognize. Astalor, he quickly realized, the lapdog of Kael'thas, bearing some kind of lockbox, and with him was another who rushed even now into the spire, the Regent himself. "Lor'themar," Darkhan called as the Regent dashed into the great room. "Greetings, Thadir," Lor'themar replied in an acid-laced tone. Lor'themar took a good look at the man he hated with boundless passion. Though he no longer wore his wide-brimmed hat, the undead mage still retained a penchant for finery. Yet his silken robes barely served to conceal the emaciated corpse beneath, little more than a skeleton wrapped in decomposing gray flesh. Darkhan's flaxen hair had turned brittle, the color of yellowed parchment. His eyes had turned white, and a host of flesh-eating insects traversed his reanimated form, trundling and writhing across atrophied skin and muscle. "I have come to put you out of your misery at last," Lor'themar declared. Once he had gleaned the truth behind Darkhan's artifice, Lor'themar had summoned his private guard and bidden Astalor to teleport them to the spire, but not before the Regent completed one small task. As Lor'themar reached for the arrow, he quickly glanced around the room. One of the Blood Knights, a female, lay near the stairs. Whether she was alive or dead, he could not tell. The remainder of the order engaged in a deadly struggle against Darkhan's skeletal rotting corpses, but the knights seemed to be holding their own. If so, that would give Lor'themar the time he needed to focus on the undead mage, the deceiver, Darkhan. "It seems my gambit is exposed after all. Very well. It is no matter. What do you hope to accomplish except to die?" Darkhan's right hand shot out, and Lor'themar was suddenly engulfed in flame. For a brief second he could smell his skin and hair burning. It felt as if the blood within his veins would boil, as if he would be cooked alive. Nearby, Vranesh managed to gain the advantage over his undead attackers. From the corner of his eye he spied Lor'themar engulfed in flames and immediately commanded the light to heal the Regent. All around the room the other Blood Knights did the same at the risk of their own lives. They paused, and as one, they cast their healing energies into the Ranger. Even Solinar, who had fought to regain his strength, cast the light into Lor'themar. Just a few paces from Solinar, an undead raised a rusted sword to attack. Blood Valor conjured a holy shield to protect his comrade, however, thwarting the Scourge's assault and allowing the knight to continue his casting unimpeded. The sensation of being burned alive quickly diminished, replaced by resplendent warmth. The power of the light bathed Lor'themar, drove away the all-consuming flame, and in its absence left only radiant serenity. Lor'themar looked to either side, where the nearby Blood Knights in the midst of their struggles were casting their healing spells upon him. Then Astalor rushed in. Darkhan's smile vanished. The lapdog had bolted into the great room, two stones zipping through the air on either side of him like small winged pets. Darkhan could immediately sense the power emanating from those two artifacts, energies he had once wielded himself in another life, but energies that now in his current form were anathema to him. He could feel the sorcery that empowered him draining from his withered body. He stumbled backward as Astalor halted and gestured, the stones flying to points on his left and right, weakening him further. Darkhan cringed, rendered suddenly all but powerless.
His minions suffered as well. They ceased their attacks and fell like wheat before the enraged knights. The master would not be pleased. Lorthamar's hand closed around the shaft of the single arrow that rested in his quiver, the one small task he had completed before accompanying Astalor to the spire. A particular fragment from the stone of spark held a shape not too dissimilar from that of an arrowhead. Before leaving, Lorthamar had quickly fixed it to a shaft he had recently fletched. It was magic bound by his own hand, a literal fragment of hope, a weapon he would now wield against Darkhan. He knocked the arrow and drew. Darkhan attempted to cast one final spell, but the power of the stones held him in check. Lorthamar released. Despite the arrowhead's slightly irregular shape, the arrow flew true, lodging itself deep in the treacherous mage's forehead. Darkhan fell to a knee, and immediately his form began to dissipate. As he clutched at the shaft protruding from his skull, the mage had time enough to emit one final mournful wail before his broken body turned fully to smoke, spreading thin and dispersing into the air seconds later. The arrow remained, however, and clattered to the floor just beyond the edge of the carpet. Several of the Blood Knights rushed to heal their unconscious female companion as Lorthamar strode forward and retrieved his arrow. He looked about the great room as the Farstriders swept in to lend aid. None of the Blood Knights had lost their lives, and for that Lorthamar was exceedingly glad. It was simple luck, really, that Haldoran and several of his men had been nearby renovating a derelict manor for use as a Farstrider enclave. But the order had survived, and it had saved his life, something he would never forget. The Blood Knights had acted as one, despite the risk to each of them. Liadrin would be proud. And speaking of the matriarch, Lorthamar felt a sudden panic. Where was she? Had she fallen? The regent grasped the shoulder of one of the nearby knights. Lady Liadrin, where is she? Urgent business. Orders from Romath, the younger elf answered. What orders? Lorthamar demanded. The knight simply shrugged in response. The regent felt an overwhelming relief that his worst fears were not realized. Lorthamar nodded to Astalor, who nodded back, and he proceeded to the entryway and out into the night. The slight damp mist blowing off of Lake Elrondar cooled his skin. He breathed deeply of the air that promised adventures yet to come, and though he did not know if he had truly seen the last of Darkhan, he took comfort in the fact that his people now possessed the stones, and Darkhan's defeat here would surely prove favorable in the ongoing negotiations with the Horde. Lorthamar, as always, felt hopeful, and at that moment outside the walls of the court he felt more alive than he had in some time. Then his thoughts returned to Liadrin. What task had Romath assigned her? Whatever it was, surely it could not match the danger her knights had faced here. Time had left its unmistakable footprint on the troll lair. The door had crumbled. Spiderwebs festooned the ceiling, spanned the dark recesses, and caked the walls. The wooden masks had long since been destroyed or stolen, and all that remained to spark their passing, as well as that of the spears and animal god effigies, were piles of dust and nondescript offal. The room smelled of rat feces, mold, and decay. Galel sat in the dark, in the circular depression atop the center of the spoke-like grooves, still stained with age-old blood, to which he had recently added his own. A small price to pay to suppress the strident clash of the light being within his head. With a trembling hand, Galel reached down to one of the mana crystal shards, picked it up, found an open space on his left arm, and slowly worked the sliver under his skin. The rush of magic seemed to lessen each time, however, and Galel would soon run out of shards. He would just have to see Orovin about getting some. But wait, Orovin was dead, was he not? A flash of memory flickered in Galel's mind, a scene glimpsed through his own eyes. Revolting image of his hand slicing across Orovin's throat. It was ridiculous, of course. He would never. Racked with sudden convulsions, Galel toppled onto his side, curled up, felt the room spin. Yes, naturally he had killed Orovin, just as the malicious elf had deserved. He was fated to die, as they all were. Orovin would pound on his door no longer. Galel smiled, began to giggle as he sat up. Knocking at my door. Orovin knocks no more. The former priest pitched his head back and guffawed. It was silly, to be sure, but it was also absolutely the funniest thing he had ever heard. Galel stopped for an instant, wondering why he should find the taking of another life humorous, and realized it did not matter. He tried to suppress the laughter that bubbled up from within, but it was no use. Knocking at my door. Orovin knocks no more.
Leadrin stepped over the rotting woodpile that had once been the door of the troll lair, and though her kind had long ago abandoned their worship of the moon goddess, her elven eyes still easily pierced the gloom. She was instantly devastated by what she beheld. Galel, seated in the circular pit, giggling uncontrollably. His lance and a few jagged crystal shards lay scattered around him, but as Leadrin stepped in farther, she realized that Galel had shoved many more into his body. Pieces of the crystals jutted from his arms in various places, and blood flowed liberally from the wounds. His eyes burned so fiercely they were almost white. Shockingly, his appearance, his glowing eyes, reminded her of one of the wretched, or worse, an undead ghoul lurking in the shadows. She had not been sure what to expect when she had arrived. She had not even been sure that Galel would be here, but she had certainly not been prepared for this. Galel? The former priest rocked back and forth, murmuring, knocking at my door. Ladrin's heart turned to a leaden weight in her chest. Here was Galel, her one-time apprentice, one of her closest friends, self-destructing before her eyes. She felt powerless. In fact, she felt responsible. Had she ignored the signs? Had she been too concerned with the order, with her own affairs? Could she have done more to prevent this madness? Galel's head snapped in Leadrin's direction. His searing eyes grew wide for an instant, his face contorted. We were not meant to survive. Galel, you need to come with me. I can help you. Shuddering, the former priest scratched at his arm, drawing fresh blood. When he spoke, his voice was a harsh rasp. We are all fated to die. Punishment for past sins. It is what he is trying to say when he screams at me. In a terrifying heartbeat, Galel had snatched up the lance and sprung from the pit, slashing with stunning, unnatural ferocity. Leadrin lifted her ranseur and blocked several of the wild swings, but 2 slashes scraped her armor. The matriarch reeled, tried desperately to counter without striking a mortal blow. She ducked one arcing swipe, lashing out as she did so, opening a wide gash across Galel's left thigh. The light radiated from Galel as he cast a healing spell, but the luminescence seemed faint, sallow. The former priest clutched his head with his free hand and screamed out as he stumbled backward and fell into the pit, dropping the lance. For a moment his face slackened, his eyes dimmed, and in that instant Leadrin caught a glimpse of the old Galel, a ghostly image of what the elf he used to be. Of the elf he used to be. Leadrin pleaded, It does not have to be this way. This is the last thing I would ever want. Your mind was always strong. You can still fight this. Galel replied, and as he did, his voice was the voice of the old Galel. When it speaks to me, it sounds like shattering glass. Tears flowed down his cheeks. I feel a part of me, the part that I want to hold on to, detached, drifting like a ship lost among them. He stopped, took to one knee, and reached out, whispering to someone or something that was not there. Leadrin could barely make out his words. Try your very best to be patient, and be strong, and most of all, not to. With an anguished cry, Galel shook his fist and pounded them on the stone floor. Anderval, I am sorry. I am so sorry I failed you. Who is Andervel? Galel, who is Andervel? Leadrin drew closer. Galel whipped his head side to side, grabbed his lance, and scuttled back. Leadrin froze, hand outstretched. Sometimes it sounds like glass, he muttered. Sometimes it sounds like twisting metal, and sometimes... Galel's hand tightened around the lance. He channeled the light into it, and it began to glow ominously. With his other hand, Galel clutched at his head. Sometimes it sounds like children screaming, hundreds of them. The former priest's eyes grew wide, burning furiously once again. All or none, Leadrin. We were not meant to survive. Galel's features twisted, and the visage of the old Galel dissipated as the creature he had become bolted, hacking, slashing, and driving Leadrin back with the power and intensity of a feral beast. The matriarch blocked, parried what she could, channeling the light into her own lance, the glow from the 2 weapons illuminating the dusky chamber, flashing brighter when the weapons clashed. Several strikes broke through Leadrin's defense as her back neared the far wall. She narrowly avoided a slash that would have decapitated her, and she knew as she countered the attack that the Galel had left himself overextended.
that he would not be able to recover in time to block or evade, that her retaliation would spell the end for him. She wept as the rancier blade flared brightly and cleaved through Galel's head, a precise clean cut that neatly removed the upper portion of his skull. The former priest fell, his body nothing but dead weight as the remainder of his lifeblood spilled onto the stonework. The glow of his lance dimmed. Liadrin ceased her own channeling, and once again the lair was dark. Liadrin sat unmindful of her bleeding wounds for the moment. She pulled Galel to her, stroking his armor, allowing tears to flow. All or none, Galel. All or none. She stayed that way until her eyes held no more tears and Galel's body grew cold. I did what was necessary, she repeated inwardly, over and over. I defended myself. Yet the memory of this day would linger, persistent and immune to purging, a permanent scar upon her soul. Hours later, as Liadrin watched the flames consume Galel in a clearing outside the ruins, she commanded the light to heal her wounds. She did her best to ignore the piercing daggers of discordant notes within her head as she did so, and she tried to push away the concern when the riot of noise seemed to stretch on longer than it ever had before. A voice, welcome and soothing, broke through the discord. You did what you had to do. Liadrin turned to see Lorthamar emerge from the tree line. He approached, hesitated, then stepped forward and held the former priestess in a tight embrace. When he did, the pain in Liadrin's head finally receded. What happened to us, Lorthamar? What happened to our circle? Lorthamar's voice was heavy. Times change. People change, Liadrin replied. As they stood entwined, Lady Liadrin briefly wondered if she was wrong. Perhaps she was doing Vandalor a disservice. Perhaps he and the priests and the paladins of the world had gotten it right. Perhaps the light was truly meant to remain just out of reach. Okay, so this is a note, but this is a note for the entire thing. That's basically just saying this is all these stories are from World of Warcraft, and this is all written during the current expansion of Mists of Pandaria. Good to know, and it's preparing for Warlords of Draenor. So these stories all of this will be wrapped up before we get to that expansion. To give some events for further reading if we wanted to. There's War Crimes. It says that's about Garrosh Hellscream's Inglorious Reign. That's maybe the Cataclysm expansion. The Shattering is the prelude to Cataclysm, and the Tides of War. Those two are both part of that. So we have those yet to read. That's the novels. We have read that. We have not read Wolfheart. I don't know which one that goes with. Vol'jin, Shadows of the Horde, we've read one chapter. But we have more to read. And there is that monthly comic book, which we still have to get into. All of those are actual World of Warcraft things. There's the Tides of Darkness. It says Offered. That's a book we've read. That's the past about Gen Greymane. And same thing with Beyond the Dark Portal, Day of the Dragon, until the comic Curse of the Worgen will show more of that. We have again this Tides of War, and there's a short story called The Blank Scroll, which will tell us more about the Trade Prince. He was only in this for a few seconds. The Council, Muradin, Moira, Kurdrin. Again, those are covered in some of those. There's also Warcraft Legend Volume 5 Nightmares. I don't think we've read that. And Rise of the Lich King, of course, which we have read. Just trying to see things that are not. They're just talking about where we can read about these. Storm Rage we have yet to read. Again, they mentioned it there. We have read the War of the Ancients trilogy. All this is just more of the same. The Sunwell trilogy is a comic book which we are about to read. That we will read that very soon. Over the next few episodes, we'll start that. So that will give us some more information on what we've kind of just other versions of that. There's Rise of the Lich King some more. Yeah, this is a lot of things by the time this is written. But a lot of these, yeah, that comic book. Just a lot of back and forth going over the same thing. Yeah, so the Sunwell trilogy, that's what's coming up very soon. It says the battle rages on, and that's just basically giving us some things that are going to happen in Warlords of Draenor. I'm not going to even read about these because this kind of covers authors, some of the stories we haven't read yet. Again, those are the things I just kind of mentioned. You can go back and kind of pause your screen. I just kind of screwed it up by pressing that button. But all right, so that was a good story. It was well written. I liked it. And most importantly, more than anything else, those characters, some of them we will see, definitely Lorthmar, I believe Liadrin. When we play World of Warcraft, this was a very long one. I knew that going in. So I wish they would have broken it up into more chapters. But we also, more importantly, what we are seeing is something has to happen for the Blood Elves to fully be able to tap into the light again and to gain the Sunwell back, because we know the Sunwell actually does still exist. I think that's tied into the Naru. And also we're seeing here the first evidence ever of Blood Elf Paladins. Although these Blood Knights, I don't know if they're going to be the Paladins that we see in Burning Crusade. But this was a cool story. All right. Hey, I thank everyone so much for watching and listening. I hope that you enjoyed it. I enjoyed reading it and bringing it to you. But this is a wrap for this episode of Lore of Warcraft. It's in the pipe. 5x5.